everyone, and welcome. My name is Maura Rogan, and I'm the director of Ignatian Volunteer Corps in Chicago. I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Polarization in Religion, Politics, and Culture, Naming the Wounds and Beginning to Heal. IVC's Ignatian values include affirming the dignity of every individual and seeking to recognize God's presence in all. Thus, it's critical that we learn how to listen and dialogue respectfully with one another. Before beginning, I want to extend special thanks to all of our webinar sponsors, especially our 2 platinum level. First, the Jesuit community of Loyola University Chicago, and second, an anonymous individual who made their gift with deepest gratitude for Tom Hurley, clergy and staff of Old St. Patrick's Church in Chicago. Our program today will run for 2 hours. First, I'll welcome E.J. Dionne, who will share his insights on polarization in our country today. Following E.J.'s remarks, I'll introduce Michael McGillicuddy, who will dive into the reality of polarization in our society and offer some concrete strategies for building bridges. Both E.J. and Mike have set aside time for questions. You all should see the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen, where you can submit your questions in writing. With that, it's my real honor and pleasure to introduce E.J. Dionne. Many of you know him from his column in the Washington Post and his frequent commentary on both NPR and MSNBC. E.J. is a government professor at Georgetown University, a visiting professor at Harvard, and a senior fellow in the Brookings Institution. His book, Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country, was published last February. E.J. is a wonderful friend to IVC, and we are so grateful that he has made time to spend part of his Sunday with us. Welcome, E.J.
Well, thank you. That is such a warm and generous invitation. I am so honored to be here. I'm honored, first of all, because anybody who was a kid educated by the Benedictines is always grateful when anyone connected to the Jesuits wants to listen to anybody whom the Benedictines tried to educate. And so I'm honored for that reason, but above all, I'm honored because of the work that everybody in IVC does, the organization itself, but every one of you on this call. I always say you can tell I am a Catholic because I believe that guilt is a socially constructive force. On balance, I think guilt makes us behave better. And I know that if I knew the stories of every one of you on this call, if I knew the work you have all done and the work you do every day and every week, I would feel enormously guilty about what I am not doing. And that would be good for my soul, or at least I hope it would be good for my soul because I might act on it. But you really are people who understand that faith without works is dead, and that if you don't demonstrate your faith to others, you're really not preaching it at all. And so bless you all for what you do, and it's why I am so honored to be here. I do not, at the risk of, well, I don't want to put it that way. I certainly mean no disrespect to God the Father or to Jesus himself, but I got to say that the Holy Spirit is in many ways my personal favorite in the Trinity, because the Holy Spirit, more than anyone is, as a very political friend of mine likes to say, the Holy Spirit is very operational, is alive in our lives and in helping us, I think, find some inspiration when we need it. And I feel that the Holy Spirit was operating for me in this talk today because I ran across, I was pondering how could I put this together? And then along came two pieces, well, one a book and one an article. And one of the pieces I am posting on the chat right now, it's a link, it should be a link, to a piece by a good Jesuit who many of you know, Father Tom Rees, who is a good friend who writes for the Religion News Service. And it's a piece that I urge everybody to read because it is directly on the subject of this session that you're having today. The headline is perfect. We need to talk, healing our deeply divided church and country. And I won't quote all of Tom. I think you'll really profit by reading it. But I really love the way he put together our problem in a genuinely balanced way, I think. I want to apologize, by the way. I should have gotten progressive lenses for the Zoom era. I read better without them, but I usually wear them. So you'll see me take my glasses on and off as I go here. But there are a couple of things he said that I think are worth bearing in mind as we try to grapple with this problem. On the one hand, we should not shy away from disagreement. Disagreement in and of itself is not a bad thing. Disagreement, in fact, is the way we learn. I am personally deeply grateful to my dad, my late dad. He died many, many years ago, but I actually wrote a column about him once. And one of the things I thanked him for was encouraging me to disagree with him. He encouraged me to argue with him. And I felt he did a couple of things that way. One, he prepared me for what I ended up doing for the rest of my life. Number two, he taught me that you could disagree with somebody and still love them. And he was one of the most loving people I'll ever know. And and I loved him right back. And we could argue fiercely about serious questions. And the third thing about argument is you learn stuff. You learn things from those you disagree with. And I think we always have to keep that in mind. The great Jesuit thinker, Father David Hollenbach, likes to advance the idea of intellectual solidarity. And I really like that even better than the idea of tolerance. I like tolerance. Tolerance is better than its alternative. But I think intellectual solidarity has an active component that says we want people around who are different from us and may think differently from us, not just because we're decent people who will tolerate them, but because we accept the fact that every single person on God's earth has something to teach us, even when they disagree with us. So to go back to Father Tom, he writes, if Peter and Paul could argue, if Pope Francis can welcome disagreement, then Catholics, and I would say all Americans, then as Catholics and as Americans, we must learn how to deal with differences of opinion in the way a family does, not the way politicians do. And one of the things he focuses on is something you all know. I don't have to tell you this. He talks about the importance of listening. And when he talks about listening, he probably is talking about something you do every day in the work you do. Because listening, as he puts it, is not just useful in helping us to communicate better. It is itself a healing art, as Tom writes. Listening is a sign of respect to those who feel left out and disrespected. Boy, I think that's important. And I think a lot of times people who kind of hate each other across political lines, especially people who hate the distant other online, do so because they feel that that person actually disrespects them, who they are, their way of life. So as Tom says, listening is a sign of respect to those who feel left out and disrespected. Many of those who are alienated in our nation and our church feel disrespected. They feel no one cares. This applies to victims of racism when white people dismiss their concerns by saying, but everything is so much better than it was. It applies to workers whose factories have been closed when they are told, just move to where work is or get retrained. And lastly, and this is the hard part that can lead to arguments again, and sometimes fierce one, that we need to speak the truth with love. And he means both parts of that. That we need to be ready to rally to the truth and defend it. And we need to stand up against falsehood and invented facts. But we also need to try to do so in love. The other reading, which I commend to you, is a new book by a young man named Pete Davis, who graduated from law school in 2018. And he gave a talk that led to this book. And I think the lesson of this book is something no one on this call needs to hear, but everybody on this call and all of us need to reaffirm, because he speaks of his generation, although I think it's seeped into all of our lives, as being in what he calls infinite browsing mode. He said, I've come to believe that this is the defining characteristic of my generation, keeping our options open. And I have to say that one of the most useful things a friend ever told me is we were doing a lot of interesting things when we were young, doing this or that. And he said, EJ, I'm afraid that when we die, if we don't make some decisions, our gravestones will carry the message, he died with all his options open. And I don't think that's what we want to do. And that is certainly not what Pete Davis suggests we do. He counterposes what he calls a counterculture of commitment to what he sees as a culture of open options. And he argues that a culture of commitment has a number of important characteristics. And again, I think they are characteristics that really define who is in this program, who chooses to be in this program. He says, the kinds of people I'm talking about here are rebels. They live their lives in defiance of this dominant culture. They're citizens. They feel responsible for what happens to society. They're patriots. They love the places where they live and the neighbors who populate those places. They're builders. That's what you guys do. They turn ideas into reality over the long haul. They're stewards. They keep watch over institutions and communities. They're artisans. They take pride in their craft, and they're companions. They give time to people. I think the idea of dedication is central to who you are as Jesuit volunteers. I want to make two other points, and then I'd love to engage two other broad points, and then I want to engage in a bit of dialogue and question and answers, including fierce dissident. Title of the book EJ just mentioned. It is, I'll hold it up, it's called Dedicated, and the author is Pete Davis. The publisher is, it's an offshoot of Simon & Schuster, but you should find it. Dedicated is the name of the book. It's got a beautiful cover, by the way. I want to just say one word about Catholic social thought, and then a word about certain habits we might develop to try to heal our divisions. We Catholics argue with each other. We are very divided as a church. We split roughly 50-50 in our voting in the last election. But there's certain aspects of Catholic social thought that ought to bring us together, or at least ought to give us a ground on which to have productive as opposed to destructive arguments. I think Catholic social thought has always been alive to the importance of balance between personal responsibility and a concern for community. Catholicism teaches both. Between individual rights and the common good. Catholicism teaches us to revere both. This sense of equilibrium, I think, could be, if properly applied, an antidote to a whole lot of what is wrong in public life. And if we actually thought about these balances, we might begin to understand that some of our differences are not because we disagree all the way down, but because you might stress community and someone else might stress individualism. You might stress personal responsibility and someone else might express a concern for community. That doesn't mean that we have nothing in common. In fact, probably each of us has some of the other thing in us. And that's one of the things Catholic social thought teaches. I argue that Catholic social thought represents a radical brand of moderation. Now, you might say that's a self-canceling phrase, but I think it's radical because Catholic social thought offers a radical critique of the status quo and its assumptions. Just listen to what Pope Francis says about our economic system or about the way we treat the planet. And for that matter, take more popes we see as more conservative, Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul. They were quite radical in their critique of the economic status quo and the social injustices in our world. but it's moderate because it understands the imperative of weighing competing goods, like the ones I just mentioned, and of seeing human beings as both fallen. In Reinhold Niebuhr's phrase, original sin is the only verifiable doctrine of the Christian church. He got it from someone else, but gave them credit, but he's associated with it, that we're fallen, but we are also capable of redemption and transcendence. Again, we usually remember one more than the other, and there's probably a frame of mind or a habit of instinct that leads people to stress one more than the other. But Catholic social teaching and Catholic doctrine teaches both. And lastly, and we could talk all night about this, the family is central to Catholic social thought. And in my view, family values, rightly understood, should challenge prejudices, not reinforce them. An emphasis on family tells us that the work we do in the marketplace is not the only kind of work that matters, and it's not the most important work that matters. Family overturns prejudices related to age. All members of the family, from toddlers to great grandparents, are appreciated for who they are, who they have been, and who they can be. And we are called to love members of our families, and this goes back to what my dad taught me. We are called to love all members of our families, even when their views are different from ours, even when their ways of living are different from ours, even when their forms of self-expression might annoy or trouble us. And I think in that love, we can learn how to empathize with those outside our families who are unlike us and who might disagree with us. So just a few concrete things that we might emphasize in the quest for a little less division. And I have to say, politically, in the short run, I am not optimistic about overcoming our divisions. I think these divisions run very deep. We have what the political scientist Alan Abramowitz has called negative partisanship. It's not even that we love our party so much, is that we really can't stand the other party and the people who are in it. I think this is going to take a lot of struggle to overcome. And I know in my own heart, I will have to struggle a lot to overcome it. But I think there are certain ways we can at least try. The first is to emphasize the concrete over the abstract. And you in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps probably have more opportunity to do that than anyone else, because you are trying to solve problems on the ground. And whether somebody watches Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or none of the above, or ESPN for that matter, doesn't matter to the problem you are trying to solve. And so we don't talk about education policy in the abstract. We can talk about this school or that child or that community college or that tutoring program. I think if we get together and talk about solving concrete problems and get away from the abstract, we begin to find bonds that we won't find if we just are part of the large abstract argument in our society. I think, secondly, we have to choose the messy reality over the false choice. I have been thinking a lot for 30 years about false choices. I mean, you don't have to choose between being pro-feminist or pro-family or pro-equal rights for women and pro-family. Most people are both. Most people, and especially fathers of daughters, suddenly become quite feminist once their daughters reach the age where they're looking to go to university and get work. You can be both pro-family and feminist. You can be both pro-environmental and in favor of robust shared economic growth. There's a whole list of choices in our politics that are cast as opposites, where that opposition, I think, is false. And we got to fight false choices. We have to stop talking about big government or no government, except for the purest libertarians and the odd old Stalinist. No one believes in absolute government or absolute absence of government. Even libertarians believe in what they call a night watchman state. Instead of that, let's argue about smart government and the services they need. This library, that park, this school expansion, that healthcare clinic. Again, goes right to the kinds of things you're working on. And I think if we can move conversations Again, this is another case of from abstractions to the concrete. I think we have ways of talking to each other again. And lastly, not local versus national, but a pragmatic choice about what works. The two core principles of Catholic social thought are solidarity and subsidiarity. We know what solidarity means in terms of the bonds we have with each other and have to recognize, and we have to stand up for each other, especially the least among us. Subsidiarity is often misunderstood as just a preference for the local. Actually, Catholic subsidiarity is very smart. And again, it's quite pragmatic. It says problems should be solved at the lowest possible level that can solve them. Which means that I don't think anybody on this call would want states or localities to take over the Social Security or Medicare programs and wreck the program we have. On the other hand, we do want to preserve the ability of localities to preserve their institutions and to make choices that affect their lives. One of my favorite controversies of the last week was the controversy over the soccer super league in Europe, where a bunch of billionaires were really trying to wreck the local traditions of soccer in countries all over Europe, and they failed in 2 days. They had to pull back because all these communities who revered their own little soccer clubs or big soccer clubs said, no, we are not caving in to a bunch of people from nowhere who are trying to tell us in this town how we should run a sport that we have revered in the way it was for hundreds of years. So localism is not just about government, it's about dealing with economic forces, and it can even involve sports. So I'll close with two of my favorite thoughts. One is from a thinker, a philosopher who is one of my favorite teachers in college, named Michael Walzer. And Michael Walzer always argued that the best kind of critics, the most effective critics, are embedded critics. They're critics who operate from inside a community, inside a belief system, who share real bonds with those they might be criticizing. And they often criticize in the name of the very values the community upholds. Best example of this, Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln quoting our own Declaration of Independence in critiquing in critiquing slavery in Lincoln's case, and segregation and injustice in Martin Luther King's case. Michael Walzer wrote that criticism is most powerful when it gives voice to the common complaints of the people or elucidates the values that underlie those complaints. So I think if you're going to be a critic, be an embedded critic. And a dear friend of mine, the historian James Kloppenberg, made a similar point in channeling St. Paul about one of the central obligations of democratic citizens. Jim Kloppenberg said that we need to learn to see through one another's eyes, to think with one another's minds, and to treat each other with charity. Our country, our democracy, our church needs more of that right now. Thank you so much. And I'd be glad to engage in some conversation.
Yeah, would you like me to read some questions? And I encourage everyone to enter some questions as well in the Q&A section. The first is, do you have any thoughts about the force of Christian nationalism in our country today?
It's real, it's scary, it's substantial, and it's not entirely new. We've had forms of Christian nationalism going back decades. And I think that white Christian nationalism is such a distortion of the gospel. And indeed, it doesn't come out of the gospel, it's imposed on the gospel. And I think it's really a case where we can talk about religion as a set of commitments, or we can talk about religion as an identity. Now, religion is an identity, and if you ask somebody, if you ask me, you say, "Yeah, I'm Catholic." But the identity isn't the most important things. The commitment is. And I guess my favorite response to Christian nationalists is to the bishop who led racial integration in a Catholic school system years ago. And somebody said, but a lot of the Black kids in our schools aren't even Catholic. Why are you doing all this stuff for them? And he said, we don't help people because they are Catholic. We help others because we are
We are.
Catholic.
Right.
And I think that is in some ways the most powerful riposte to a kind of Christian nationalism that there is.
Thank you. Next, I wonder how much of today's polarization arises from biases, racial, socioeconomic, religious, that are imprinted very early and deeply, and then cynically awakened or pandered to and legitimized.
Can I just say yes? I think that's a very perceptive, that is very perceptive. But I think that social conditions and the political interests of particular politicians can either be more healing or can deepen division. Times of economic turmoil, I think, or great economic inequalities can create angers and resentments, which we can understand. I think we should understand empathetically, but can lead people down paths of prejudice as a way of either explaining or lashing out against injustices that they perceive and that are legitimate injustices. I think, at our moment, where the country has become, through immigration, substantially more diverse over the last 50 years. We were roughly 5% foreign born in 1970. We're now closer to 14% foreign born now. That's just a reality. That's a real change. The numbers are like they were when the Italians and the Jews and the Poles and the Greeks came in around the turn of the last century. And we had this reaction when the Irish came in after the famine. So we have circumstances in which we can respond either in a welcoming way, or we can respond by feeling threatened. And again, I don't think, I don't think we necessarily need to lead with a condemnation. We can understand that people might feel threatened, but we should condemn behavior that is rooted in prejudice that attacks the other. And I've always thought that I have never fully understood at the deepest level anti-immigrant feeling among just about anybody who's Catholic. Because we all came, everybody in America except Native Americans came from somewhere else, but we Catholics are part of an incredible tradition of immigration. Catholic immigrants were not regarded as white people by some of the Protestant majority. There were cartoons of the Irish in the 1850s casting them as the equivalent of Southern slaves. I mean, how can we who stem from immigrant stock lash out against immigrants? But yes, I think circumstances and leadership can create conditions in which kind of latent prejudices become more active and can become more virulent and dangerous.
And I know that Mike is going to touch upon this next question as well, but how do you listen respectfully when you can't agree on a common set of facts? I find this is happening more and more to me, and it's frustrating.
It is. This is a systemic problem that I struggle with in many different ways, one of which is I teach a class at Georgetown on media and politics. And we have talked a lot about the flight from common conversation. And when you look at this little device that we all have in our pockets, it is a fantastic device. And the number of actual real facts we have at our disposal instantly because of this object are extraordinary. And we can fact check ourselves. As somebody who writes a column, I fact check myself constantly on this device. But just as this device is incredibly efficient at spreading truth, it is incredibly efficient at spreading falsehood. It's like all technology. It's not, the technology is neutral. It's the use you put it to. And I think we have, again, it's one of those two-sided phenomena. 40, 50 years ago, people watched the same evening news, three networks, one of three networks, ABC, CBS, or NBC. Over time, starting in the 70s, they might have watched Jim Lehrer and Robert McNeil, and then the Lehrer show. But basically, that was it. And so for 30 minutes, people got the raw material for their water cooler conversations and their arguments, but they agreed on the facts. Now it's much harder. I am not sure how we solve this in the short run. In the long run, I have long been an advocate of much stronger civics education requirements in the schools. And I think now strong civics education should be accompanied by what a friend of mine likes to call media literacy, where we learn to discern what forms of media give us facts and what forms of media give us falsehoods, because we can disagree on the basis of the same facts. We can interpret those facts differently. Those are real arguments. But when we are arguing over, say, whether, I'm sorry to be partisan here, but I don't think it's a partisan statement, whether Joe Biden actually won the last election or not, which, as Mitt Romney would say, is an absurd point, then we're in a lot of trouble. And I don't have any instant solution for that. Although I guess I should plug my newspaper and say, well, you should read a great news. Everybody should read a good newspaper, but then you would have an argument over whether that was factual.
And in fact, that leads to the next question. Do you think, and we only have time for a few more, do you think the major networks and social media, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, Twitter, Facebook, do they thrive on polarization? It seems like they dramatize and look for only conflict in the news. Or has this always been the case, but electronic media has accelerated this?
Well, I think that, again, before the days of opinionated cable, before the days of Twitter and the explosion of opinion online, I think the conversation was somewhat different. And people like me are asked all the time, don't you miss Trump? And it is quite possible that absent Trump, the circulation of some of our even of our best newspapers will plateau or drop. There were a lot of people who came to news media because of the energy Trump injected in politics, either negative energy or people who supported him. I for one, do not miss that kind of energy. I'm hoping for a different kind of argument. Again, I like opinion. I read a lot of points of view I disagree with, but I think we might have a chance to argue about real things. So I think the short answer is yes. I am, again, I'm a liberal, so I'm particularly critical of Fox News, and I could defend that. But even if you want to put that aside, I do think that we have a media environment that thrives more on conflict. And I can say that, except for dog pictures, which always sell well on Twitter, a somewhat nastier tweet with an edge will get more retweets than one without. That's just a fact. And I always say we got to try to resist the Twitter, if we are on Twitter, as I am, we got to try to resist some of the temptations of that medium. We don't always do so. Even when we don't, I think we should try to be responsible. I try not to do a lot of negative tweeting against people who disagree with me or complain about it. If people want to say people can say what they want about me or what I say. But I do think that the environment we're in encourages it, but I still believe the political polarization preceded the media polarization. I think the media polarization was a response to political polarization that we can probably trace back really in earnest to the beginning of the Clinton years. And I think it's been widening from, the Gingrich-Clinton confrontations after the '94 election to the conflict over Florida, to the birthers against Obama. It's just been a widening gap. And I think you're seeing that in the country where, at the moment, I think my math is right on this. You can fact check me. If you take all 435 congressional districts in the country, there are only 9 Trump districts that have a Democratic congressman and only 7 Biden districts that have a Republican congressman. So we are kind of partisan all the way down now in a way that we weren't before.
Do you have time for 1 or 2 more questions?
Sure. I'm happy to stay as long as you like.
There's lots of questions here. This is switching gears a bit. Would it be accurate to say that the U.S. bishops have deep divisions among themselves? If so, how does that impact their credibility among Catholics and non-Catholics?
I think the divisions are astonishingly deep. I think they are. They were very clear from the very first day of Joe Biden's time in office. If you remember, on that day, Archbishop Gomez put out a statement that sort of welcomed Biden, was said they were glad he's Catholic, he's a good person, but they suggested he could be a cooperator with evil because of his situation on his position on abortion. That wasn't very welcoming. And Cardinal Cupich in Chicago immediately reacted. And I should say, I have a lot of respect and admiration for your Cardinal and Archbishop. I first met him when he was a bishop in Sioux Falls.
Okay.
And then I figured he had a split on the NCAAs this year between Loyola and Gonzaga out there in his old diocese. I don't know how he resolved that, but as long as you root for the Jesuit school, you will not be excommunicated. Cardinal Cupich put out a statement right away saying this was ill-considered. They hadn't consulted. Bishop McElroy out in San Diego put out a comparable statement. Archbishop Gregory, a somewhat more moderate, but still he wouldn't associate himself with it. So yes, I think we are a very divided church. And I mean, I think it reflects a very divided flock. I think Catholics themselves are very divided. And again, I think it depends on which aspect of Catholic thinking you emphasize. More conservative Catholics put a lot of stress on abortion and for some gay marriage and gay rights. And more progressive Catholics put a lot of stress on social justice and may worry, as I do, that spending all your time trying to make abortion illegal, it's not going to happen. And in my view, wouldn't even reduce the abortion rate very much because you'd have a lot of illegal abortions. I have thought on the abortion issue, I would love to have us find at least some common ground on saying, let us do what we can to have fewer abortions in America. And if we want to have fewer abortions in America, that is rooted in a respect for women, in a respect for poor women who have abortions at a much higher rate than wealthier women do. And let's give them the aid and assistance they would need to make the choice for life more plausible, more possible. But yes, there is, and I do think it's a challenge to the bishop's public voice, but I think we all have to be honest, and people like Cardinal Cupich have been very honest about this. I think the continuing effects of the scandal have had even more of a negative impact on their capacity to speak publicly. But I am hoping that maybe in this time of division, some of them, they sit down and try to pull back from this brink that we're at. But I'm unfortunately not very optimistic about that. We tend to be meaner. A conservative friend of mine said this, so God bless him. He said, those of us who call themselves Christian are meaner to each other in politics than almost anyone else because they feel the other person is an apostate. And so he said, he was criticizing this, and he said, we might be just a trifle more Christian with each other in the way we argue. But he's a very good person. I'd like him to preach that gospel to everybody.
Well, and I wish we could go on with more questions. I just got a message on the side here saying we need to move along. But EJ, I am so grateful for your being here with us today and just laying the foundation on this topic.
Well, thank you so much. If I went on about 5 minutes longer than I anticipated, and so I may have cut questions. Let me give you an email that if you want to send me a question, I'd be glad to answer. I'll give you it's an email. It's EJ Dionne Jr., no period, just EJ Dionne Jr. @gmail.com. And I will give you a holler back if you get in touch with me. But again, I'm really honored to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Well, it has been a real thrill to have you. So thank you very much for giving up part of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
And with that, I want to turn to our other presenter, Michael McGillicuddy. And Mike, I am proud to say I know very well. He has been an IVC Service Corps member since 2017, when he retired from a dual career as both a CPA and a licensed clinical social worker. He dedicates hours weekly to his service site of Colby House Jail Ministry. The theme of polarization has been a constant presence in Mike's life from the 1960s to the present. He has researched the topic deeply over the years and has given more than 40 presentations to faith communities, universities, and businesses. Mike's facilitation work for Braver Angels, an organization focused on ending political polarization in America, was featured on CNN's The Van Jones Show, and his views on polarization have been shared by National Catholic Reporter. Mike, we are so grateful to have you with us today to share your expertise and thoughts, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Maura, and thank you, EJ. What a wonderful presentation. I think that there will be a lot of compatibility and resonance between the views that we present here. So I wonder if you would agree with me that we are a house divided. I'm convinced that there's an accelerating crisis of polarization in America today, laying to rest any pretense whatsoever that the conflicts among us are in the tolerable range. Many of us have come to regard the other, whether party or race or region or religion or gender or generation, as a threat rather than as a neighbor. There is no shortage of evidence. In 1958, Gallup asked a random sample of Americans whether the party affiliation of a prospective son-in-law mattered to them. About 72% of respondents didn't care. Fast forward to 2016, Gallup rephrased their question in a gender-neutral fashion, but only 45% said that they didn't care, a drop of 27 percentage points. In a recent academic study entitled Lethal Mass Partisanship, we learned that 42% of people in each of the major American political parties view the opposition as downright evil. Nearly 1 in 5 agree with the statement that their political adversaries, quote, lack the traits to be considered fully human. They behave as animals. More than 15% of each party think, on occasion, that the country would be better off if large numbers of the opposition died. And get this, it was disproportionately the better informed of each party's voters who were the most partisan and hostile to the opposition. Sobering, no? But it gets worse. More than 13% of sampled Democrats and Republicans reported that violence may be justifiable if the opposing party were to win in 2020. January 6th should have been no surprise. What's going on? Why are we choking on outrage? We have to figure this out. As James Baldwin wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. There are many dimensions to the polarization afflicting us: cultural, historical, religious, psychological, political, and personal, deeply personal. I'm struck by the number of people who are wounded by polarization. 1 in 6 family members have stopped talking to each other. Behold the daughter who, unable to abide her elderly mother's political views, insisted she move out after years of living together. Behold the mother tearfully recounting the viciousness of her 2 adult children's arguments over politics. How about the sick feeling in the pit of our stomachs when we realize that if we state our truth, we will give offense and they will take offense. We will both be hurt and we both risk the permanent loss of a valued relationship. The value proposition for this presentation is that we can do better, we can heal, but only if we reframe, reimagine, and retool. We need a paradigm shift. The critical issues which so deeply divide us demand our full attention. Precisely because these issues are so critical, we need to be well prepared to engage with them. Focusing solely on differences among us can impede healing and undermine efforts to reconnect. Consequently, our focus in the remaining time today will be on the dynamics of polarization rather than the issues which polarize us. So let's dive in. Polarization means a sharp division into 2 profoundly distinct social groups which emphasize differences and minimize commonalities. Please imagine that the tumbler that I have in my hand is filled with metal shavings, which I then pour onto the table. The shavings would mound in the center and trail off on the sides, forming a normal curve of sorts. But when a horseshoe magnet approaches the mound, the shape of the shavings changes. The magnetic force reshapes them into two clusters, and so it is with polarization. Consistent with our mental wiring, a powerful dualistic mindset tends to pull everything, people, organizations, concepts, and commitments, to one pole or the other. Once sorted, elements tend to remain fixed there even when there is no intrinsic relationship among them. Like powerful currents, they keep us in tow. Here's a real-life example from Twitter. This slide depicts the patterns of communication after a particular controversy ignited a tweet storm. Each cluster reflects the density and direction of tweets. Note that almost all tweets stay within the blue and red clusters. Note how few contexts there are between clusters. In an essentially tribal manner, we choose to communicate with the like-minded, except when we go on the attack. There are benefits to seeking out those who get us and centering our lives around them. Picking sides satisfies our need to belong. It offers us the expectation of unswerving support, and it addresses our need to manage complexity. This last one is so important. When the issues confronting us are far more vexing than we'd like, prepackaged answers to complex questions can be very alluring indeed. And yet, these benefits must be weighed against the costs we incur from tribal affiliation. We come under tremendous pressure to suppress uncertainties, to refrain from public criticism of allies, and to minimize within-group differences. Psychologist Adam Grant makes the link between conformity and polarization. He says, peripheral members fit in and gain status by following the lead of the most prototypical members of the group, who often hold the most intense views. The tribe then demands a united front. Disputed territory won at great cost must be defended. Lost respect, integrity, and security demand retaliation. Most people who care deeply yield to the pressure. This is our story, and I'm sticking to it. United front, disputed territory, retaliation. Note the military allusions. The phrase culture war captures the dramatic alignment, which has split American politics and culture into two warring camps, defined by profoundly contrasting worldviews. At the 1992 Republican Convention, Pat Buchanan argued, quote, "There is a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a culture war as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as was the Cold War itself." Wars dehumanize. This one is no exception. This binary culture war mindset scorns nuance, crushes ambivalence, and suppresses non-conforming views. It is so destructive, so regrettable, and yet so deeply embedded in our discourse. If we persist in speaking of culture war, that metaphor should be extended to incorporate culture war casualties, culture war refugees, and the task of transforming culture warriors into culture peacemakers. In 2008, Bill Bishop published The Big Sort, the story about how America came to be a country of swelling cultural division, economic separation, and political polarization. Bishop powerfully documented the great American divide, sorting us into two like-minded communities characterized by both mutual incomprehension and mutual loathing. Bill Clinton captured the moment, noting that we're less racist, less sexist, less homophobic than we used to be, but one remaining bigotry seems to be intractable. We resist being around people who fundamentally disagree with us. Electoral disparities explain the political impact of polarization. Term of art here. A landslide jurisdiction is one in which there is a disparity of 20% or more between the vote total of the winner and the loser. In 1976, about 1/4 of American voters lived in counties that a presidential candidate won by a landslide margin, over 20%. By 2004, it was nearly half. And by 2016, over 60% of us lived in landslide counties. It is scant comfort that the proportion slipped to 58% in 2020. And this directly confirms something EJ said. In only 10% of US counties were these elections decided by single-digit margins. We say that we are a two-party nation, but I wonder, with 90% of House seats safely in the hands of one party or the other, are we becoming two one-party nations? Is there a center? Can it hold? Here's Bill Bishop's conclusion. And I quote, "You get the picture of a nation increasingly polarized, where nearly 2 out of every 3 voters live in a place with an overwhelming political majority, a nation divided between the central cities and their suburbs, and small towns and rural counties. Any common ground between the two sides has disappeared." That's Bill Bishop speaking, not me. "The trajectory is unmistakable. The ramifications are enormous. People living in homogeneous communities grow both more extreme and more certain in their beliefs. As we sort, the political majority acquires greater voice and power, while the political minority loses influence and feels threatened. At a certain tipping point, the political majority becomes much less deferential to the political minority's concerns. The threatened minority then can respond in a variety of ways. It can disengage, or obstruct, or bunker into enclaves, or move across town or across the country. Think about it. How would you react if you knew that your deepest convictions were regarded with contempt by most of your neighbors? You may wish to comment in the chat box. Again, how would you react if you knew that your deepest convictions were regarded with contempt by most of your neighbors? In his book, Love Your Enemies, economist Arthur Brooks argues that we are beset by a pandemic of contempt, a toxic brew mixing anger with disgust and scorn. Brooks argues that when someone treats us with contempt, we never quite forget it. This reminds me of Maya Angelou's famous dictum. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Psychologist John Gottman argues that the greatest warning signs of impending relationship collapse are indicators of contempt: sarcasm, sneering, hostile humor, and eye rolling. There are many theories as to why polarization is increasing today. One places the blame on disappearance of large-scale unifying events such as World War II. Another, consistent with EJ's comments, focuses on the fragmentation of information sources, essentially cable and the internet. Also implicated are the purification of our political parties and the penalties, such as primarying, which partisans levy against bipartisan attempts at compromise. No one explains polarization better than social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. He forcefully disputes the belief that reasoning is the driving force in our behavior. As deeply intuitive creatures, Haidt argues, our gut feelings drive our strategic reasoning. Haidt introduces his theory, motivated moral reasoning, with a compelling metaphor. He asserts that our minds work like a press secretary defending the boss's sometimes indefensible policies. Think about it. Imagine a press secretary announcing new policies to the assembled press corps. Imagine further that the press pushes back with intense criticism of these policies. Can you even imagine the press secretary responding, "Gee, you make good points. Back to the drawing board. We'll change our policies just as you suggest"? Not a chance. The press secretary's job, after all, is to craft a defense for whichever positions the boss dictates. Haidt argues that our minds operate in a similar fashion. Intuition is the boss, exerting intense influence on our beliefs and stories. Reason is the press secretary, justifying these intuitions. In other words, intuitions come first, automatically and almost instantaneously, with reason following suit to defend them. There are three key implications to keep in mind. The first explains why persuasion so often fails and how it might succeed. Our arguments, no matter how compelling, are unlikely to convince someone who has strong moral intuitions in the opposite direction. As Matt Dowd once tweeted, "You can't break an emotional bond someone has with logical arguments. You must first build a heart connection before arguing the facts. You can't force, much less mock, someone into a change of heart." The second implication of motivated moral reasoning is that our intuitions both bind and blind us. Shared intuitions bind us to cultural, political, and religious groups who share similar moral convictions. Once bound, these gut feelings blind us to alternative moral perspectives, making it difficult to understand or even listen to them. Social psychologists at the University of Illinois at Chicago concluded that liberals and conservatives have at least one thing in common: essentially zero interest in listening to opposing points of view. The third implication of motivated moral reasoning is that we are all subject to confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and interpret new evidence in ways that confirm what we already think. We differ on so much, but in confirmation bias, we are united. I don't think we appreciate how it impacts our lives. Our confirmation bias filters influence us to understate evidence contradicting our beliefs and overstate evidence confirming them. They filter out inconvenient truths and reinforce convenient untruths, making them difficult to dispute. People are hurting. Disunion is rife. So a faith community response to the big sort would certainly be called for, even if there were no direct applications of polarization to religion. But of course, religion is anything but exempt from polarization. Lutheran church historian Martin Marty characterizes church polarization as the greatest divide. He writes, quote, "There least of all do people evidence openness, humility, and readiness to hear viewpoints with which they might disagree, even when these are voiced by fellow believers. It's becoming increasingly common to choose churches which conform to our worldviews and thereby avoid churchgoers of the opposite persuasion. Partisanship has become such a defining part of our identities. When our political and religious identities conflict, increasingly it's party affiliation which is the more durable, while religious affiliation the more likely to change. So I wonder, what might we miss when we sort ourselves into religious enclaves of the like-minded? Again, I invite you, if you wish, to comment in the chat box. What might we miss when we sort ourselves into religious enclaves of the like-minded? We are, We are accustomed to framing polarization in terms of contrasting positions along a belief spectrum, as this image of a football field depicts. On our left, the blue zone are those most progressive, while on our right, the red zone, those most conservative. In between, there's a nebulous purple zone. When viewed from this perspective, it seems to me, differences are stark and movement appears foreclosed. Let's explore an alternative, more fluid image. To incorporate commonalities in style among those with contrasting views, please imagine folding the previous image of a football field in half at the 50-yard line. The yard line markers now overlay each other. First, let's look downfield from the goal line to the 10-yard line. Here dwell the activists. Admirers call them prophets, detractors call them zealots, but no one can doubt the intensity of their commitment, the depth of their passion, nor the remarkable sacrifices they make for the cause. There is so much to admire here. Where would we be without them? Yet there is also heartbreak and desolation, hopes dashed and wounds still raw. On a remarkable range of values and beliefs, their views either align almost perfectly or are mirror opposites. The most intensely polarized Americans often feel that their home in this country is in peril. Despite the symmetry of those feelings of siege and exile, they regard each other as a threat. Can bridges be built within this zone from conservatives to progressives and vice versa? I have to honestly say that it's hard for me to imagine. The differences are so foundational, the scar tissue so fresh, the agenda so opposed, the resistance to compromise so entrenched. I believe that the most polarized 20% of Americans are not now ready for cross-partisan dialogue, although I have seen it happen. Life throws us curveballs now and then, when airtight ideologies and tribal alliances no longer work for us. As Leonard Cohen famously sang, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." When tribal certainties crack, the time may be ripe for building bridges among the most committed and engaged at the far ends of the spectrum. Near midfield, within the 40-yard lines, reside the most disengaged Americans. Many are preoccupied with more pressing concerns, like survival, while others are frankly uninterested. Together, they comprise about 26% of the population. There's another smaller centrist group comprised of the tribalists, the conflicted, the ambivalent, the culturally homeless. Some among them are heretics in exile from the dominant tribes. Others self-isolate because they feel rejection should they enter the fray. Together, they occupy a lonely patch of ground between dominant worldviews. While their grasp of nuance might equip them to serve as bridge builders, they often opt out, exhausted by culture war skirmishes. They need to be invited in. And what about the folks between the 10 and 40-yard lines? Those who identify as conservative or progressive, but perhaps more lightly. With varying degrees of intensity, they align ideologically with those near the end zone, and yet share with folks at midfield an openness to compromise and a sense of exhaustion at rising polarization. They are at the fulcrum. They are decisive. The future of the American experiment, politically, culturally, and religiously, depends on their willingness to engage the challenges of depolarization and embrace culture healing. Their challenges include acquiring skills for dialogue, building bridges in all directions, and focusing on commonalities rather than differences. This New Yorker cartoon captures one man's story. The guy on the phone says, "Oh, not much, just sitting here sifting through an old scrapbook of past injustices and imagined slice." That's his story, and he's sticking to it. As Faulkner famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Stories steep in resentment deepen wounds and prevent healing. Meg Wheatley writes, "We need to be able to talk with those we have named enemy. Fear of each keeps us apart. Fear of each other keeps us apart. Most of us have lists of people we fear. We can't imagine talking with them, and if we did, we know it would only create more anger. How do we break free of this prison? Poet Padraig Otuma says, we must tell different stories, not necessarily new ones, but deeper ones. Stories of remembering, belonging, safety, and shelter. The powerful experiences which have deeply changed each one of us can be incorporated into stories of redemption rather than of resentment. If our stories are complicated and nuanced, and I believe they are, we have cause to imagine that their stories may be complicated and nuanced as well. Listening, deeply listening to other stories has the capacity to set us free and engender something we need so desperately, which is trust. Consider, for example, this delightful excerpt from Amor Towl's novel, A Gentleman in Moscow. Quote, by their very nature, human beings are so capricious, so complex, so delightfully contradictory, that they deserve not only our consideration, but our reconsideration and our unwavering determination to withhold our opinion until we've engaged with them in every possible setting at every possible hour. StoryCorps has a wonderful program now called One Small Step, dedicated to the proposition that it's hard to hate close up. Politically dissimilar people are matched and then invited to visit for 50 minutes. The focus is on getting to know each other, on their lives, not their politics. The results are promising. Here's one exchange. The first person says, none of us are simple enough to be just thrown into a bucket. Like we're all too darn complicated for that. And the partner responds, and the end results of having these conversations and storytelling needs to be that people are so many things. Yes. Actors Alice and Bill Brown find great joy in sharing their theater background to enhance and enrich the faith life of others. They do so both as proclaimers at Holy Family Catholic Church in Inverness, Illinois, and as creators and performers of visionary Stations of the Cross, one about the cancer journey and another about the 1958 Our Lady of the Angels school fire. Alice and Bill will now reenact a redemptive story in which wounds are named and healing begins.
Dan Gallagher here. I grew up in a big farm family, Catholic, and enlisted in the Army shortly after graduating from high school. Like many guys from my generation, I served in Vietnam for 13 long months. I never regretted serving my country, although I returned home with PTSD. My re-entry into American society was difficult. As a matter of fact, it was downright hostile. Anti-war protesters confronted us as we deplaned at Fort McCord. One protester in particular caught my eye. An attractive young blonde brandishing a sign written in red paint like dripping blood, baby killer. I saw more hate in her eyes than I had seen in the eyes of the Viet Cong. Scars from that experience were destined to stay with me for many years.
My name is Betsy Mulligan Dake. I was that young blonde. I was raised in a devout Catholic family that literally embraced the commandment, thou shalt not kill. By the age of 20, I was caught up in the maelstrom of the Vietnam protests and anti-war activism. I painted the sign that Dan saw. I raised it high before the returning soldiers. I believe it was steely determination that Dan saw in my eyes. It would be years before I could see how Dan read hate in them.
life goes on. I returned to Montana for college and law school, and along the way, married and had 5 children. My conviction that the U.S. was right to intervene in Vietnam never faltered. Eventually, I began hosting Veterans Viewpoint, a discussion program on Missoula Public Radio. A major topic of discussion on the show was the giant peace symbol, which mysteriously appeared on a telephone relay tower above Missoula in the early 1980s. When I saw that giant peace symbol, I took it as a personal affront. It symbolized everything negative peace activists said about us, and it became something we veterans learned to hate.
I grew up in Arkansas, but made my way to Montana. When I saw the peace sign on the hill above Missoula, I knew I belonged here as the director of the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. But clearly, the peace symbol on the hill was a point of deep contention in town, cherished by peace activists, but resented by veterans. A filmmaker decided to make a documentary about the controversy, and he figured that Dan and I were suitable spokespeople for the 2 polarized groups. We finally met at a Veterans Day Remembrance Ceremony in 2005. I was determined to build bridges to veterans, but I was worried that they would view a peace activist like me as the enemy. My suspicions were well grounded. Dan not only resented me, but he remembered me from Fort McCord, though I didn't remember him.
It's true. For all those years, I could close my eyes and see Betsy's face, and the face of the other anti-war activists. I knew they were people genuinely interested in bringing about peace, but I had difficulty getting past the anger that ambushed me upon my return. Through the filmmaker, we got to know one another, and I invited Betsy onto my show for a discussion about peace.
And that's when we started an honest dialogue. We discovered what we had in common. Both of us were raised in Catholic homes where our fathers challenged our opinions and encouraged spirited yet respectful dinner table discussions. Maybe that's why our on-air exchange was not contentious like most talk radio, but respectful.
Sitting across from me in the studio, I encountered not the angry blonde from my memory, but an incredibly decent, intelligent, and articulate person in Betty. I realized that I had been labeling these people as naive, or worse, and yet she was making sense. I thought, if she's listening to me, I need to listen to her.
I also realized the need to move beyond self-righteousness and stereotypes. I get it. We in the peace community can think that we occupy the moral high ground with all the right answers. But we need to approach people with contrasting ideas with more curiosity and with a willingness to learn from them. I was finally able to distinguish the war I opposed from the soldiers who fought in it. The healing that needs to occur requires a sign saying, you are a person. You are not the war.
For me, it was healing to be approached in that way, to be able to express myself without being dismissed. I didn't have to stop being a veterans activist around Betsy. And that acceptance helped me to forgive those who hurt me in their opposition to the war. I really admire Jesus, what he said and what he stood for. It isn't enough to just profess your faith. My parents raised me to believe that you have to act out your faith. Whenever I have an ethical conflict, I ask myself, what would Jesus do? What would my mom do? Living out my Catholic faith means I can't just be belligerent and arrogant. I have to forgive.
In 2011, Dan invited me to speak at the annual American Legion Veterans Day ceremony. Standing at the podium, I expressed my regret for the way that some peace advocates had disparaged veterans. I said that it removed the opportunity we had to learn from each other, to listen to and appreciate each other. And that I was there that day to try to right a wrong and reopen a door. After the ceremony, veterans came up to shake my hand and thank me.
It choked me up when I heard Betsy's speech. That statement of regret and apology is something I had waited 40 years to hear. Following year, the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center honored me with Peacemaker of the Year award. I told Betsy, you got to be kidding, when she told me the decision was unanimous. In my acceptance speech, I spoke of the courage I saw, not only on the battlefield, but in anyone willing to fight for a cause. I saluted not only my fellow veterans and soldiers, but anyone willing to take a stand on principle, especially those who use the language of peace. I closed with the words I used to say as a boy saying Mass. For each one of you who seek common ground despite obstacles and rejections, dona nobis pacem. Give us peace.
Simple conversation and mutual respect turned Dan and me, once adversaries, into friends. We get together for lunch about once a month, and we remember each other's birthdays. We quote one another when talking about peace.
Such a friendship was once unthinkable for me. I thought I'd go to my grave hating the people who hurt me when I came back from Vietnam. As a statement of the respect and friendship I have for her, I asked Betsy to be one of my pallbearers when the inevitable time arises.
I was deeply touched. The bridge built between us isn't limited to discussions about war. It extends to any differences of opinion which cause division. So it is particularly relevant during these polarizing times. I believe we all have tensions in our lives, knots that need to be untangled. It could be a neighbor, someone in the grocery store, or even a member of our own family. We all have places where we can find opportunities to make peace.
Thank you, Alice and Bill, for modeling reconciliation. While you're on, I'd like to ask you, I think this is the 5th time perhaps that you've done this in a workshop. What it evokes in you to tell this story?
Well, for me, it was amazing. The first time that we did do this, it was certainly relevant to the time. And today, 5 years later, it's even more relevant to the time than it was. So it's fresh again.
And for me, I love this example because as we get further away from the Vietnam War, and younger people who didn't experience it, like some of us maybe did, we forget that this is an example that was, I mean, just amazing. The fact that you would have a veteran and an anti-war activist, and that they were able to come together and connect. This story gives me hope. This story says to me, no matter how polarized we are, the opportunity is there for all of us. But it's only going to happen one person at a time, I think.
That's absolutely right. Thank you again, Alice and Bill.
Our pleasure.
This story is created from an article entitled How Simple Conversation Turned Adversaries into Friends, written by John Rosengren in U.S. Catholic, and the link for it is going to be in the resource listing that you will receive. So where do we go from here? I propose to you this afternoon 5 paths to depolarization, 5 steps to becoming artisans of peace. Path number 1. Seek first to understand, to open our minds. It's challenging to break free of comfortable thought patterns downloaded years ago. Pero sí se puede. Yes, we can. One trap we fall into is the binary bias, the human tendency to seek clarity and closure by simplifying a complex continuum into 2 opposed categories. The binary privileges black-white, left-right, good-bad thinking, and suppresses non-conforming views. The antidote to the binary is deliberately introducing greater complexity into the picture. Complexity disrupts overconfidence, engenders humility, and cultivates curiosity about other perspectives. This next comment is going to refer directly to something EJ said. Striking the right balance between the competing claims of individuals and groups will always be precarious and contested, yet accommodation is the only plausible alternative to war. Living together peacefully requires all of us working to understand the contrasting approach as well as the shadow side of our own approach. When we demonize those whose conception of the good differs from ours and assume that their motivations are evil, moderation and compromise become moral failings. Recall the words of Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. If only it were so simple. But as we all know, the issues that matter are rarely simple. Mental maps influence our perceptions. Each viewpoint is a view from a point. We see issues through different lenses, each understandable in the context of distinct beliefs and lived experiences. One very important key to understanding another worldview is to discover what values and beliefs its adherents hold sacred. Understanding contrasting positions in their most plausible and persuasive form is extraordinarily important. It can be exceptionally difficult to accurately represent contrasting positions. It is much easier to create and demolish straw men, poking holes in the weakest opposing argument, and sealing our disdain with a smirk, a sneer, or a snide side comment. We have to do better. Questioning our assumptions can be a true friend of wisdom and a tonic for polarization. I am not counseling surrender of core beliefs and values in order to achieve common ground, but some forms of certainty close the door, breeding smugness and contempt. Ben Rhodes' biography of Barack Obama includes a passage in which the president is quoted as saying, "What if we were wrong?" Sweet. Today, I'm going to issue 5 challenges to you. The first is the understanding challenge. And I challenge you to learn to state the case for contrasting views so comprehensively and so fairly that proponents of such views acknowledge that they have been heard and understood. Doable? Path number 2, seek next to empathize, to open our hearts. Imaginatively entering into the feelings of others is particularly challenging when their views are so jarringly dissimilar from ours. And yet, so much wounding results from our inability to imagine how it feels to be the other. How can we cultivate empathy and tenderness? Well, I believe we can begin by asking whether worldviews predict character. I'm not sure they do. In fact, I believe the political and cultural views can be a very poor measure of character. Can we agree that there are many admirable, loving, inspiring people on the other side, and that there are among us many whose characters can't hold a candle to them? Dispensing compassion only to people within certain set boundaries constitutes empathy redlining. Empathy flows from naming the wounds that we've sustained in life, the letdowns, the emotional scars, and for some, the abuse. And empathy grows by naming the wounds we have inflicted. The heart is where we wrestle with the other. Heartbreak is what happens when this wrestling leaves us wounded, leaves all of us wounded. The deep feelings of estrangement the progressives experience in some conservative quarters are identical. The feelings now are identical to those conservatives experience in some progressive settings. No tribe has a lock on heartbreak. Let's also examine our responses to disparaged core convictions. We all want to belong, and shared worldviews serve as a badge of social membership. Holding fast to out-of-favor beliefs and values can be painful because we care so deeply how others judge us. When our core convictions are derided with obvious exasperation, whether by cutting words or rolled eyes or curled lips, the pain can be exquisite and long-lasting. Such wounds can motivate us to hide our views or to abandon them under pressure, but they can also make us defensive and shrill. Hurt people hurt people. How about cultural condescension? How about cultural condescension and ridicule? What I call the nuclear options of the culture wars. I wonder about the long-term impact of the ridicule embedded in late-night TV humor, not just on those who are continually mocked, but also on those of us who regularly consume and delight in the mockery. Cultural condescension is one factor contributing to the deep grievances which have such a hold on us today. This brings us to our second challenge. The empathy challenge is to recenter our attention from head to heart in order to imagine how it feels to be the other. When we enter into the deep story of others, their hopes and fears, their pride and shame, their resentments and anxieties, we can climb over the wall of obstacles to solidarity and make heart connections. Can we do this? Path number 3, seek then to befriend, to build relationships. Does debating those with sharply contrasting worldviews build relationships and reduce polarization? Not so much. Debaters listen to the gist of the contrasting argument in order to prepare a rebuttal designed to defeat the other. Dialogue is just the opposite, compassionate listening without rebuttal. If we were together physically, rather than virtually, we would spend a great deal of time focusing on dialogue and then practicing it in pairs. We would talk about building our communications repertoire, setting an appropriate tone, putting conversation partners at ease, attending to power and privilege imbalances, and leaning in to test whether it's safe to openly speak. When inevitably profound differences become apparent, bravery and grace are important strengths to draw upon. Above all, we need to be better listeners. Braver Angels co-founder, family therapist Bill Doherty, elaborates on effective polarization. He argues that we are often, quote, baffled by how smart people could think that way, and are thus limited on understanding them on their own terms. It's as if we don't speak the same language. We are in desperate need of bilingual bridge builders. That is to say, people who are reasonably fluent in the languages of the other worldview. Culture peacemakers may need to commit to learning a bit of the other language. When dialogue is uncomfortable, even painful, we recall that our partners are just as committed to a set of core convictions as we are. Instead of walking away at the first misunderstanding, we disagree with civility, respecting our partner's sincerity and decency. We hope for reciprocity, but we must be willing to have the conversation that the other person is ready to have. What a blessing it is when conversation partners become friends. But friendships are under unprecedented strain today. I know I don't need to tell you that. So many have withered, casualties of the culture war. It can be much easier to loathe and caricature each other than to accept each other as complex and contradictory. How can we come to regard each other as friends, even as kin? We need models. I'm fascinated by improbable friendships. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson began as friends, but the frictions of that era damaged their relationship. A common friend intervened and persuaded them to reconnect. Adams then wrote to Jefferson, quote, "You and I ought not to die before we've explained ourselves to each other." After years of silence, they were in correspondence for the rest of their lives. Wow. Notwithstanding starkly contrasting judicial philosophies, Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg sustained a warm friendship rooted in intellectual heft, mutual respect, and love of opera. For many committed folks, this is a real stretch. Not everyone has the capacity or desire to enter deeply into competing worldviews. The friendship challenge, issued to each of you, is to seek out, not merely tolerate, viewpoint diversity in our friendship networks, just as we seek friends who are racially, religiously, and economically different than we are. Widening the circle of those we befriend recognizes that we all have much to learn from each other, many stories to share about our formative experiences and shifting identities. This challenge may take the form of reviving a strained friendship or laying the groundwork for a new one which breaks the mold. Any takers? Path number 4, seek also to cooperate, to build bridges. It's not enough to just talk to one another. We also need to cross tribal boundaries to do things together. This requires us to erect controversy-free zones in our lives. Cooking is one, gardening is another. Sports was until recently, and I hope it will be again. Volunteer service in truly diverse settings humanizes everyone involved. The Ignatian Volunteer Corps believes that feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, and protecting the vulnerable demand no particular party affiliation or theological orientation. To everything there is a season. Right now we are in a season for speaking truth to power, for grappling with enormous disparities, for coming to grips with racism. I would never want to diminish the gravity of this moment, nor quell the intensity in the air, but it is no betrayal of this moment to also propose a season for cutting slack, for bracketing differences so that we can be in each other's lives. Curbing divisive rhetoric requires discipline. Who doesn't like to talk smack now and then? And yet, restraint in certain moments may be a critical component to healing and bridge building. The cooperation challenge issued is to identify common threats which cross over cultural, religious, and political boundaries, then carefully frame responses which respect diverse core beliefs and identities. Any buyers? Sometimes I wonder if we're nearing a breaking point. When I hear talk of civil war, for example, my immediate impulse is to dismiss it as alarmist, and yet the very fact that it's uttered at all should give us pause. I'm reminded of a lament attributed to Abraham Lincoln. I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. That's when core beliefs kick in. I'd be profoundly discouraged without them. Path number 5. Seek always to intercede, to draw upon faith. While the specter of polarization is cause for alarm, it is not cause for despair for those who put their hope in God. Sister Helen Prejean of Dead Man Walking fame offers a Christian perspective. We live in a culture that says choose sides, but the gospel of Jesus calls us to be on both sides, according to Sister Helen. So I wonder, could it be that the pain of our divisions drives us to our knees, opens our minds and softens our hearts for a rediscovery of the foundations of faith? Perhaps the Holy Spirit, another source invoked by EJ, perhaps the Holy Spirit has a grand synthesis in mind, far surpassing our divisions. We will need to be patient and tolerant as we await its unfolding. Lutheran martyr and prophet Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a beautiful reflection. The first service that we owe others is in listening to them, Bonhoeffer said. Just as loving God begins with listening to the word of God, so the beginning of love for others is learning to listen to them. The ministry of listening is committed to us by God, who is the great listener and whose love we share. We should listen with the ears of God that we may speak the word of God. Each wisdom tradition has identified worthy paths from division to solidarity. Here's an example from the Catholic tradition. In 17th century Bavaria, a husband contemplating separation from his wife sought counsel from a Jesuit who lifted up the couple in this prayer. In this religious act, I raise the bonds of matrimony to untie all knots and smooth them. The marriage healed. Years later, their grandson commissioned a painting in memory of this reconciliation. Pope Francis, then a young Jesuit studying in Germany, viewed the painting in the church where it hangs. Deeply moved by both the painting and the story it depicts, he brought devotion to Mary, untie her of knots, home with him to Argentina. Now it's spreading around the globe. This icon, a modern rendering of Mary, untie her of knots, was crafted by Franciscan brother Robert Lentz. Note how the knotted and discolored ribbon, representing our tangled and messy lives and relationships, is untied and cleansed as it passes through the hands of Mary. To her many titles, perhaps we can add patroness of the painfully polarized. The intercession challenge is to pray, alone and together, to the great listener, for the untying of the knots of polarization, for the wisdom to discern our role in the revolution of tenderness, for the humility to recognize that we need each other, and for the grace to love through our differences. Some concluding thoughts before we go to Q&A. There are few more keen observers of the present moment than Greg Boyle, the Jesuit founder of Homeboy Industries. Here's his read. America has rarely seen more division, polarization, and disunion than at the present time. And yet our best selves longs for connection. Deep down, we know that separation is an illusion, that there is no us and them, just us. We want to remember that we belong to each other no matter how we voted. In a compelling book entitled Turning to One Another, Meg Wheatley writes, quote, I believe we can change the world if we start listening to one another again. Simple, honest human conversation, not mediation, negotiation, problem-solving debate, or public meetings. Simple, simple, truthful conversation where we each have a chance to speak, we each feel heard, and we each listen well. I believe what Meg believes, and I suspect you do too. So in summary, what can we do then about the forces that seek to divide us? A full response to this question requires deeper analysis, but we've taken an important step this afternoon. If we agree that we can do better, if we acknowledge the wounds we've endured and the wounds we've inflicted, the healing can begin. Then we can prioritize relationships over agreement. I urge you to reflect on the understanding, empathy, friendship, cooperation, and intercession challenges to see if there are any you might embrace. A comprehensive electronic resource listing, including articles, books, videos, and organizations, plus a list of conversation starters to move us forward, will be sent to all registered workshop participants. Thank you. And now for your questions and comments. While you're thinking them out, I've got a question here on the table about, on a 1 to 10 scale, how serious a problem is polarization? So you might want to enter something in the chat box about that. But now it's time for Q&A.
Mike, I see one question here to get us started.
Okay.
What if we come to feel that a longtime friend's political choices reflect profoundly different and abhorrent values, not just an opposing set of solutions to political, economic, and social problems?
So that happens. There are people that are, I would say, sort of beyond conversation, but that should not be our go-to. That should not be our assumption. I think we should forcefully interrogate ourselves on that to see if perhaps we've misunderstood, or whether there are factors in their lives that incline them to this particular point of view. I mean, I think if you look for ways to work people out of your life, you'll find them. If you look for ways to incorporate them into their life, if you basically say, I want to be in relationship, then you're more likely to find them, although not necessarily so.
Okay, thank you. And I encourage you all to ask some questions in the Q&A as we continue. We have about 10, 15 more minutes for Mike to answer some questions. I've got one while we're waiting for some more questions to come in. So you say that we can come together, if we change our ways, if we really talk to one another and listen. How hopeful are you?
Maura, honestly, it depends on the day. On a spring Sunday afternoon where more than 200 people have dialed in to grapple with this topic, I'm hopeful. I haven't yet read the comments on articles, opinion pieces yet of the paper. Sometimes I become nearly despondent with the harshness, not the disagreement, but the harshness, the categorical nature of the opinions shared there. Things that I've never heard anybody talk to each other that way before, which suggests to me that this goes very, very deep. So it depends on the day, I would say, Maura.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. In reference to Father Greg Boyle's words that separation is an illusion, This is a common teaching among Christianity and numerous other global religious and cultural traditions. How might we more proactively partner with sisters and brothers across cultures and religions to contribute to our work of bridge building and working to confront injustices in our human family and creation?
Well,
That was a lot. Was that a lot?
Well, that's a wonderful thought, and I would say the first thing I would say is not easily can we do that, but it's absolutely imperative that we find a way to do it. And I think it's going to be a one person at a time thing. I don't think grand symposia on trying to get huge groups of people together to grapple with these things one-on-one are the best way to do it. At least they're not the best way to get up to speed. So I think we need to basically say that I don't understand where the other person is coming from, and then you lead in a different way. You might say, I wonder if I can ask you a question about your point of view. I'm really interested in understanding positions that are from outside of my silo. Would you ever be interested in talking about that? Okay, could we set aside 15 minutes sometime to talk about that and see how the person reacts? We have to be prepared for no. Again, we have to dispense with this idea that we're the only wounded people out there. There are people on the other side, I can guarantee you. There are people on the other side that feel that they've been brutally dismissed and they're terrified to enter into these conversations. But if we can find a way to engage with them and not push an agenda, but simply get to know what life experiences led them to that experience. I think that's the step. And then if we can start doing this within our churches and we can do it across churches as well.
And the conversation starters that we'll be sending out offer some great ways to begin that.
Yes.
But speaking of church, the question here, do you believe that the U.S. church is doing enough to encourage better discourse?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I don't really understand it. If you get a chance to glance through the resource listing, you're going to see a good 10 to 12 really exciting organizations that are grassroots focused, that are creative in trying to create a space for people to get together. I mentioned the one small step, but there are many others, Braver Angels, many others. I'm not aware in any of the Christian denominations or the three major Jewish traditions of anything comparable that brings people together across differences. I mean, there are obviously many church-related people that are involved in the secular movements, but there is something called the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, but it's not grassroots and it's pretty largely academic. I think that I would love to see someone really dive into these other organizations and see what the magic formula is and find a way to do it within religious traditions.
Thank you. There are so many good questions coming in. How do we help support our young students, our young college-age individuals to remain open and listen?
Oh, wow. There's some wonderful work being done in this area as well. I think by modeling it ourselves is to saying, I'd love to talk with you sometime. Would you be interested in talking? And I'd be interested in your take on these various things. And really step away from our own personal agenda. That's hard sometimes. It's hard for me anyway. But simply try and allow them, give them the format. It's sort of to me like conversations around race. We've had the floor. We white folks have had the floor for a couple hundred years now, right? And so now it's time for us to sort of listen rather than look for equal time. And I think it's the same way with young folks. For us to sort of, instead of sort of teaching them how to set themselves straight, for us to listen to them.
And I might be generalizing here, but I think many of our age group grew up with very black and white thinking, whereas many younger people do come with a greater understanding of the gray.
Yeah.
What do you think will be the turning point?
Okay, interesting question. there is an evangelical Christian, sort of a very controversial, wonderful writer by the name of David French, okay? I would urge people to become acquainted with his work. David French wrote a book last year called Divided We Fall, okay? And he did this very thorough analysis of polarization along the lines of much of what EJ and I talked about today. But then he included two scenarios where there could be something akin to a civil war. In other words, two different states would break off. It sort of goes like this. A state takes a position that the federal government believes is incompatible with the Constitution, and the federal government insists that they dismantle. They refuse to do so, and there's a standoff. Now, his examples are one from the right and one from the left, so it's not ideological. So he included this in the book in order to be a warning sign. This is where we're headed if we don't learn to talk to each other. And what he's found is that lots of people are saying, yeah, I think we should do that. Enough of this already. I can't bear those people any longer. Now, we know that would never work, but the fact of the matter is that there is a sense of impatience with this, that this is sort of a hopeless enterprise and not even wanting to try. But to me, the alternative is inconceivable. In even the most red or blue states, there's a good 35 to 40% of people of the opposite persuasion. How on earth do you do that? You know, how do we disentangle?
I'm looking at one question here. How do you see the impact of the pandemic-related restrictions on our polarization?
Okay, interesting also. There hasn't been a lot of research on this. Yeah, and it hasn't been overwhelming, but at the margin, it seems to have reduced polarization somewhat. There seems to be some, we are of course hearing about outrageous cases where people flaunt things, but there has been, in my experience, the story is getting on board and sort of coming together around this. So obviously there are prominent examples to the contrary, but I think that at the margin, in a very small way, this has brought us together more than separated us more.
And I'm taking part of a question here. Are there strategies you would recommend for de-escalating a conversation when it does become heated?
Right. So there's a set of them that we don't have the opportunity to do, but there are ways to do this that are sort of that finesse it. The final step, though, is to say, after you've tried these various steps, okay, the final one is to say, I think that we're going to need to move on, and this maybe this isn't the time for this conversation, but on a note of grace rather than in a note of anger, if at all possible. But yes, there are ways. There are ways to do that. There are ways to do that that I'd be happy to share with people through email.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier, I'm forgetting the author that you just referred to a few questions ago. Is he included in the resource that we're sending out?
Yes, it is. David French.
That's it. Okay. The author, Barry Lopez, feels that the old stories that have mentored us no longer do so, and that we need new stories. Who will write them, and what should be the themes?
Oh gosh, so true. And if we all have these stories, if we don't write them, they won't be told. So I would love for people to tell their story about Ginsburg-Scalia relationships.
In their own lives.
In their own lives. And how they've been able to surmount this, sort of the way that Bill and Alice talked. But yes, new stories need to be written that don't foreclose, that are wide-ranging. The other thing is fiction. This can be done largely through fiction. This doesn't have to be through social science. And I think I used the example from Gentleman in Moscow, and I think a lot of fiction can tell these stories in a new and fresh way.
Thank you. And I'll finish up with this question, which brings it back to IVC. What are some of the ways that you see IVC serving as a catalyst for these conversations?
Wow. I happen to be at a site a couple blocks from Cook County Jail. And we work both doing reentry work for people leaving jail and prison, but also within the jail and prison. And we all of us, staff and volunteers alike, feel passionate about this work. And I just find that we can come around about that, and our side thoughts on issues, we don't need to lead with them. EJ made a comment on that. I can't bring to memory at this moment, but he sort of said something like, don't lead with condemnation. Okay, so we talk about what we have in common, and people have various opinions, and they aren't always disinclined to share them, but we never let that get in the way of what we have in common. And that's a wonderful thing about volunteering, and it's one of the reasons I love IVC so much.
Thank you. And Mike, I want to thank you and EJ. And to all of you, thank you for joining us this evening and for supporting IVC Chicago. And it's our hope that you found the webinar to be informative and thought-provoking. We are happy to keep this webinar space open for 15 more minutes if you'd like to ask a question of Mike in the Q&A. But please note too that, as he said, we'll be sending up a follow-up email with some additional resources on this topic and on Ignatian Volunteer Corps. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your evening. And again, we will keep it on, Mike, for some questions.
Okay.
Let's see here. And can you see them? Because you might want to look through them too. On the bottom Q&A, you can just scroll through, go towards the bottom, because EJ's questions are up on the top as well.
Okay.
Let's see.
Oh, here's one. Here's one that I think is great. Membership in traditional churches is in decline, and membership in evangelical megachurches is increasing. Why? I think this is a fascinating question, and it doesn't have conventional answers. That is to say that it's not necessarily about the liberal conservative split. I think it's perhaps relates in part to the greater liturgical flexibility, the greater participation, the incorporation of non-traditional forms of celebration, sometimes the community there. So yes, I think that the challenge, I think, for us as Catholics is to find a way to be true to the tradition that is attractive to people who are not now drawn to it.
Right. I'm looking up a bit. Can you elaborate on what you mean by the grand synthesis?
Okay, so when I, with my limited capacity, look at some of the controversy swirling around us, both religiously and in secular terms, they seem to be categorically incompatible with themselves, right? But that's because I think I'm sort of locked into some binary ways of looking at things. And it seems to me that the Holy Spirit, well, it doesn't seem to me, I know the Holy Spirit is not bound by my categories, and maybe there's some way of looking at things that would be inclusive and fresh, that would disrupt the binary, the conservative liberal binary. So that's, I guess, what I had in mind on that.
Okay. I'm looking up here. In terms of electoral disparities, gerrymandering by our elected officials disrupts the possibility for smaller disparities. How does that get changed?
Okay, so I believe, now I'm not an expert on this, but I believe that some states, I want to say Maryland perhaps, has developed a system which takes the the drawing of boundaries somewhat away from the political process and does it more systematically. And so I think that that's a promising way of doing it. Now, we got to be honest about the fact both political parties have a vested interest in having relatively more safe seats, right? I mean, so that's symmetrical. That's symmetrical. So how do we do that? I think that gerrymandering is really an important consideration. It certainly contributes to polarization, but increasingly, people are just moving away from each other. People don't want to live around them. And so it's happening, and with all kinds of ramifications that I sort of find disturbing. But it's not that people decide, oh, the people next to me are of the opposite party, I think I'll move. It's more like this. The people, I'm going to move anyway, right? I'm going to move. Okay. And do I want to move into a community that's more copacetic, more like me, okay? It's just the same way I think Catholics are increasingly choosing parishes, right? Right. And I think there are pros and cons, but it has implications because what we find, and this is incontrovertible in the literature, is that when we're around people like us, right, we become more like them, okay? And the disparities among us widen. Right. Think how welcome, think about your circle of friends. Think about them, and then imagine somebody at a cocktail party makes up a talking point from the opposite party. What would happen? Mm-hmm. I don't think they get invited next time, right? Mm-hmm. Unless they repented. So, we've got this thing where we don't, like Bill Clinton said, we sort of don't want to be around them. What's the end result of that?
And you and I have talked about that, I know. Yeah. Let's see here. That the Catholic Church and religion generally has been a source of answers and clarity on issues of morality. How can the Catholic Church facilitate more dialogue and understanding among its members? Would it require a change in its doctrines and priorities in public policy, or perhaps not, given how divided individual Catholics are politically and on social, moral, economic issues?
Okay, great question. It goes directly to the thing about what is the end game here. Virtually all of the large Protestant denominations have split. The Methodists are struggling with it now. I've done workshops in Methodist churches. They are struggling with this right now. Is there the will for reconciliation? Or is the dis-ease at being with those people so overwhelming that we, in fact, decide someday to de facto split? Mm-hmm. And I guess I don't have an answer so much as a question for participants. If the future of American Catholicism, world Catholicism, required some distancing from favored views around cultural and religious issues, some acceptance of other points of view, is that too much to ask? Would we prefer to split? Or do we want it, or do we feel that we would miss something precious by splitting? In other words, obviously, we don't want to split, but is the price that they have to agree with us, right? Right. And I just don't see that happening. We have to contend with the fact that this is an enormous organization with people from all over the world that don't share our sensibilities on many, many issues, right?
Right. One participant wrote, "I love the idea of hearing more stories of how others came to understand persons they were originally polarized from. Aren't the gospel stories great examples of personal transformation, i.e. prodigal son, woman caught in adultery, the tax collector invited to dinner?"
Yes, yeah. Yes, they are. And if I can hearken back to a question a few back, are those accessible in this context? In other words, when somebody talked about younger people, sort of not resonating for much of what we do. Are those stories, do they resonate, or can they be made to resonate in a way that speaks to this particular issue?
Thank you. And I'm going to ask, are there any additional questions? I'll wait a minute to see if any new questions come on. And if not, we will wrap up. But we thank you for your interest. I don't think I see any additional. Mike, again, someone said thank you. Thank you again for spending so much time in preparing this and delivering it so beautifully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank
Good night.
you.